When Vladimir Putin launched his Ukraine invasion, the very concept that the war might drag on for almost 4 years never entered his mind. Even when Ukraine put up a stauncher resistance than Putin expected, he assumed the war would still be over in a year or two. But the Ukraine war still rages, seemingly with no end in sight, and Putin has brought Russia to the edge of economic collapse to keep his war machine churning. Russia's president is desperate as he has watched over the war that he started slowly break Russia. Now Putin has been forced to do the unthinkable by breaking a massive taboo in Russian economics. What is that taboo? It involves Russia's gold reserves and something that Putin never thought he would have to do, selling Russia's gold. On November 19th, Interfax reported that Russia's central bank has started liquidating gold held in Russia's National Wealth Fund, or NWF. The operation is supposed to mirror what the country is already doing with the Chinese yuan that it has in its NWF. Russia buys and sells that currency to try to raise more money for Putin's war, but the NWF is also home to vast reserves of gold, and that commodity hasn't been immune from Putin's pilfering. Russia is now selling one of the most stable assets that it has in large quantities, and it's taking that asset from a rainy day fund that is supposed to exist for emergency support. The Ukraine war is not the sort of emergency for which the NWF was created, at least not for anybody other than Putin. The central bank released a statement explaining its decision, saying, "As domestic gold market liquidity has increased in recent years in connection with the implementation of the budget rule and other NWF operations, the Bank of Russia conducts these equivalent transactions in the domestic market not only by buying and selling yuan for rubles, but also partially buying and selling gold. This also allows us to maintain the necessary level of currency diversification of international reserves, in which the share of gold has grown significantly in recent years due to its rising price." In other words, the bank is trying to make hay while the sun shines by selling gold when it's at a high price point, and thus more able to generate the kind of revenue that Putin needs for his insane Ukraine war spending. The issue isn't with the concept of selling gold. Russia has done that many times before and will continue to do it in the future. The issue is that this gold is coming from a fund that is supposed to be protected, one that exists for emergencies, not for the Kremlin to make a quick ruble to sustain the war that Putin started. Interestingly, it also seems like many of Russia's gold sales are being made primarily to domestic consumers. At least that's the impression given by comments made by Russia's Deputy Minister of Finance, Vladimir Kolyachev. Considering that in recent years the public's demand for gold as a store of value has increased, the turnover of the domestic gold market has grown, and the liquidity of the domestic market has increased. The Bank of Russia's execution of these equivalent operations in the domestic market, not only in yuan but also in gold, is more justified, Interfax reports Kolyachev is saying. Russia certainly seems ready to make a lot of money from its NWF gold sales. In March, the price for an ounce of gold was a little over $3,000, since risen by 1.5 times, hitting the $4,000 mark in October. There's also an element of Russia attempting to limit the impact of external factors that could have an impact on its economy here. Interfax says that the mirroring operation under which these gold sales are taking place is often done to minimize the impact that budget flows and external conditions can have on inflation, aggregate demand, and the ruble exchange rate. Inflation in particular has been a problem for Russia in 2025. According to Trading Economics, the country's annual inflation rate climbed as high as 10.3% in March. It has since dropped, reaching 7.7% in October. However, that is still a high rate for a country that targets a 4% rate. There are hints of Russia trying to stabilize a struggling economy in these gold sales. We'll explore that concept later in the video. However, the biggest concern in this move from the Russian perspective is what the sale of gold from the NWF represents. In its report on Interfax's article, United 24 Media says that this move marks a significant shift in how Russia taps into the financial buffers it's created that are supposed to serve society, not the Kremlin. It claims that the main reason Russia is selling this gold is to sustain government spending, which has skyrocketed since Putin launched his invasion. In October, the Carnegie Endowment said that Russia has experienced 3 years of increased spending, averaging out to around 10% of the country's gross domestic product, or GDP, for the period between 2022 and 2024. That high level of spending isn't sustainable, especially for a country that has been rocked by sanctions, which is likely why Russia is taking the step of dipping into the gold reserves that make up part of the NWF. This is a taboo move, United 24 Media claims. However, it doesn't explain exactly why. There could be several reasons, including the fact that Russians, at least right now, place a lot of value on stockpiling gold. We mentioned earlier that Russia may be selling its NWF gold reserves to the domestic market, and there's plenty of evidence to suggest that the market would gobble those reserves up, at least up to a point. On October 29th, the Moscow Times reported that Russians have been purchasing gold in record amounts, seemingly due to the belief that gold is the best investment vehicle they can choose for safeguarding their existing wealth. A staggering 282 tons of gold have been purchased by Russian citizens in the form of coins, bars, and jewelry since 2022. In 2025 alone, it's expected that Russians will buy 62.2 tons of gold. Mining.com adds that this Russian gold hoarding is so extensive that the amount of gold that Russia's citizens collectively hold is equal to Spain's entire national reserves of gold. That's a lot of Russian love for gold, and it's a love that Putin himself has exhibited in the past. Russia's president has himself bet on gold as one of the foundational assets that could be used to prop up his country's economy. Back in June 2019, the Moscow Times reported that Putin spent years buying gold by the bucket load, even when the price of the commodity was bottoming out. The approach paid off several times for Russia, and the Kremlin's obsession with gold appears to be helping Putin out once again, now that he needs more money for the war. The point we're making here is that the sale of gold seems to run counter to the trend of Russia and its people wanting to stockpile as much of that commodity as possible. That may be why what Russia is now doing with its gold in its NWF is a taboo, as United 24 media puts it. Russia should be able to fund the Ukraine war without dipping into its NWF gold reserve, but it can't. And the stockpiling that has occurred for so long in the country is now going toward a war, rather than the sort of social reforms or modernization programs that could benefit the everyday Russian. Speaking of how Putin shouldn't need NWF gold to fund his war, another taboo may be that the use of this gold is a silent admission of the Kremlin's failure to tackle Russia's budget deficit. As AA reported on November 11th, Russia's budget deficit is up to $51.9 billion during the first 10 months of 2025, largely due to increased Kremlin spending predominantly focused on the war. The same outlet reveals the gulf between Russian state budget revenues and expenditures. Between January and October, budget revenues rose by 0.8% compared to the same period in 2024. However, budget expenditures skyrocketed by 15.4%. In real money terms, that means Russia made $369.3 billion, but it spent $421.2 billion. Russia is spending more than it earns, and the impact of that overspending is starting to bite. Russia, despite its claims of using mirroring to try to shore up the value of the ruble, is likely selling NWF gold to cover a portion of this budget deficit. That wouldn't be a problem if the deficit had been caused by Russia being forced to spend on an emergency, such as a natural disaster that racked the country. But the money is being spent on a war that Putin wanted, but the rest of Russia would have happily not seen happen. That brings us to another taboo. This isn't what the gold in the NWF is supposed to be used for. We've already mentioned that the NWF is Russia's rainy day fund into which it can dip when it has an emergency. United 24 media adds that the NWF, along with Russia's natural resources, is one of the pillars that sustain the entire Russian economy. That fund has been shrinking fast since Putin launched the war, to the point where it was 5 times lower in the spring of 2025 than it was during the same season in 2022. The same outlet also explained how Russia keeps the NWF stocked in July. The fund operates under a specific scheme. When oil prices are high, a portion of the extra revenue is taxed and directed into the NWF. At the time of writing, the fund receives additional tax income from oil sales priced above $60 per barrel. For instance, if Russia sells oil for $75 a barrel, the Kremlin channels the surplus into the fund, which can then be spent or saved for future use, the outlet claims. The dollar values on oil may have changed due to sanctions implemented since the article's publication, but the point remains the same. The NWF only grows when Russia is selling oil at a certain price. That has not been the case for years now, aside from a few exceptions. So Russia is draining the NWF at a time when it isn't in a position to pump money back in, now or at any point in the near future. It's also draining that fund not for the social programs for which it was intended, but so that Putin can spend more money on soldiers. In November 2024, Medusa reported that almost half of the money that Russia had set aside for social welfare in some of the country's regions was being spent on the massive wages and signing bonuses being offered to soldiers. Fast forward a year, and UNN published a similar report, noting that some Russian regions were cutting their social programs so they could use the money to pay for the bonuses due to Russia's military recruiters. These stories aren't directly related to the NWF or Russia's recent gold sales. However, they do showcase where Putin's priorities lie, and they're not with the Russian people. For Russia's leader, it's all about the Ukraine war tunnel vision that he has developed since February 2022. That's why the NWF has gone from an enshrined fund to be used for emergencies to just yet another pot into which Putin can dip his fingers when it suits the only thing that seems to matter to him anymore. Perhaps the key question is now simple. If Putin is happily draining the NWF by selling its gold reserves, how much money is he actually making for his Ukraine invasion? United 24 media offers some insight. In addition to revealing that the Kremlin has been quietly selling off NWF gold for most of the war, it says that the NWF held 405.7 metric tons of gold prior to the invasion. Russia had liquidated 57% of that stockpile up to the point that the news broke of the latest sales. There are now just 173.1 tons of gold left in the NWF, meaning that Russia has sold off a staggering 232.6 tons of the gold reserves it had stockpiled for emergencies. We can approximate how much money Russia has earned from this gold using figures from Gold Avenue. It says the price of gold is around $131,000 per kilogram. There are 1,000 kilograms in a metric ton, so at $131,000 per kilogram, a ton of gold would be about $131 million. That's quite a lot of money. Multiply that figure by 232.6, and you'd get roughly $30 to $31 billion generated from NWF gold sales since Putin launched the war. Bear in mind that this is an approximation based on current gold prices, and with the NWF now only having around $50 to $60 billion left when accounting for both gold and currency reserves, there are only so many more times that Putin is going to be able to do something like this before the entire fund collapses in on itself. According to the Moscow Times, these sales are being done to inject currency into the Russian market, but that isn't the real reason. Russia is selling NWF gold because its economy is on the brink of collapse and the Ukraine war has grown so expensive that Russia can't afford it anymore. Just on pure daily expenditure alone, the money earned from the most recent NWF gold sales doesn't stretch all that far back. Back in February, Ukrainian intelligence chief Kirill Budanov suggested that the Ukraine war is costing Russia around $1 billion per day. Other estimates are lower, with the Kyiv Post stating in September 2024 that Russia was spending around $300 million per day on Putin's war. Neither is a good amount of expenditure for Russia. Selling the amount of NWF gold that Russia has sold has bought Putin between 30 and 100 extra days of warfare, based on these daily estimates. Putin must see those extra days as important. After all, the latest sales of NWF gold come at a time when Russian oil revenues are collapsing. Over the last few months, Ukraine has repeatedly struck Russian oil refineries to create a fuel crisis in Russia. At the same time, Western sanctions have stung Russian oil, with the US sanctions on the massive oil producers Rosneft and Lukoil being particularly damaging. These measures are working. On November 6th, United 24 Media reported that Russia's oil revenues had collapsed by 27% year-over-year in October. Sanctions played a role, as did the softening of global crude oil prices and the Russian ruble strengthening. That means that the Russian government pocketed a healthy chunk of change. The country's finance ministry claimed that it had made $10.9 billion from oil and gas sales in October. However, that's also $3.9 billion less than it made from the same types of taxes in October 2024. Russia is making less money from its natural resources. Think back to what we mentioned as being the two pillars of the Russian economy earlier in the video. Those pillars are the NWF and Russia's natural resources. And the first of those pillars is strengthened by Russia selling oil for more than it anticipates. So when you have a situation where oil sales have declined substantially, Russia gets hit with an economic combination of punches. It has less oil and gas tax money to pump into the war, forcing it to seek alternatives like selling NWF gold reserves. And it also can't replenish those reserves because the low oil and gas revenues are the reason why it had to pull from those in the first place. It's a vicious cycle into which Putin has led his entire country. And it's the reason why the reserves held in the NWF have consistently dwindled as the war goes on. Russia's overspending on Putin's war has pulled Russia to the brink of a financial recession, which is being exacerbated by the fact that the wartime economy that Putin has created is cooling down. Back in August, the Moscow Times reported that though Russia was posting anticipated GDP growth, the boost from wartime spending given to the Russian economy was fading, and growth is nowhere near what it once was. In fact, the first quarter of 2025 saw Russia experience its first economic contraction since 2022. Growth is near 0%, with an estimate of 0.3% growth in the third quarter of 2025 hardly being encouraging news for Putin. Russia's economy is basically stagnant, and it seems likely that even the small amount of growth it might have could soon turn into a decline. Some Russian economists, such as Vladislav Inozemtsev, suggest a possible contraction of up to 1.2% because there have been no real reasons for growth, not even at the start of the year. A contracting economy generally means lower total economic output for the country, and that translates into even less money being funneled into Putin's war machine. At least less money from the revenue Russia earns from its natural resources and other industries. There is still money in the NWF that just lost another portion of its gold, but that won't be the case for much longer if Russia keeps selling off its NWF assets. There's an interesting coda to this story, as United 24 explains. Russia currently maintains more than 2,300 tons of gold in total national reserves, the fifth largest stockpile in the world. but the new sales underline how heavily the Kremlin now leans on its sovereign buffers to keep its wartime economy afloat. Hold on a second. If Russia has 2,300 tons of gold reserves, why is it tapping into the comparatively small reserves left in the NWF? The reason is surprisingly simple. Nobody wants to buy that gold. That's been the case since March 2022, which is when Business Insider reported that Western sanctions are making it more difficult for Russia to trade gold with potential international buyers. That still seems to be the case in November 2025. The NWF gold sales are being made domestically, and there's only so much money in Russia that could be spent on these much larger reserves. Russia's people may have a voracious appetite for gold, but even they can't spend the billions upon billions of dollars needed to help Putin liquidate all or even most of Russia's 2,300 tons of gold. Perhaps the Russian businesses and people to whom Putin might try to sell this gold can no longer afford it. That's the sort of thing that happens when you collapse your country's economy to fund a war that lasted far longer than you thought it would. To make matters worse for Putin, one of Russia's other traditional moneymakers has started failing him. For decades, Russia could rely on other countries to buy its weapons by the bucket load, to add a few $1 billion into its coffers. Now, that's no longer the case, and India has just proven it. India has humiliated Putin by refusing to buy Russia's broken Su-57 fighter jets. Find out more in our video, and remember to subscribe to the Military Show for more coverage of Russia's worsening financial situation. And thank you as always for watching.